When the clock strikes midnight, the murmurs begin. But this isn't just another spooky story time. It's a bone-chilling blend of shadowy fiction, disturbing true crime, eerie legends, and interviews that just might haunt you. From cursed hallways to the darkest corners of the human psyche, nothing is off the table. And if our voices have found you, it may already be too late. New episodes drop each week. Follow Murmurs at midnight and invite the darkness in.
Speak When Spoken To, A Tale of the Ozark Gauro by Jamie Spooky Ellison. Welcome to Murmurs at Midnight, where we delve into the deepest recesses of the human psyche, Ozark Mountain legends, horror fiction, and eerie true crime. So get your popcorn or your security blanket ready. In the deepest belly of the Ozark Hills, where the rock swallows the sun and the air tastes like stone, the old folks whisper of a thing called the Gauro. They say it roams the blackest caves, not for prey, but for company. When it finds the lost, it leans close enough for the dark to breathe on their ear, and it asks a riddle. If you answer true, the cave will show you the way out. If you answer false, you'll walk in circles until your lamp drowns and your bones turn to limestone. Tonight, we go looking for the voice in the stone. This is Murmurs at Midnight, and you've stepped into the darkness. Chapter 1. Hummin' Hills. From Speak When Spoken To. The first time I heard the hum, I was 9 years old and sitting on a cedar stump behind my uncle's smokehouse, picking bark from my knuckles and waiting for the whippoorwill to quit crying. That sound, what most folks around here pass off as wind rolling lazy through the trees, it weren't no wind at all. Not to those who've truly listened. Not to those who've stood awful still, real close to the limestone cliffs when the moon's leaning in sideways and the trees stop their breathin'. That hum ain't no accident. It ain't just the sigh of dirt shifting or rocks settling in their beds. It's older than weather, older than water even. It belongs to something deep and deliberate, buried beneath these Ozark ridges like a heartbeat in stone. Granny used to say the hills been singin' since before man had ears to hear 'em. She'd sit on her back porch swing with a jar of muscadine jam in her lap and tell me things I weren't supposed to carry. She'd whisper about what stirs beneath, and her eyes would glaze like dew on a tombstone. I never heard her raise her voice, not once, but when she spoke of it, the Gauro, her jaw stiffened like she'd bit down on cold iron. Most folks round here'll tell you it's just a story, some backwoods boogeyman made to keep children from wandering past the blackberry bramble after sundown. But if you've lived long enough in these hills, if you've felt the cold settle too quick in the marrow of your bones, or seen the fog pour low like spilled milk across your fields, then you know better than to call it just a story. The Gauro ain't no myth. He's a reckonin'. A crawlin', tusked creature with a back lined in spines like the blades of forgotten sins. He don't hunt like wolves or bears do. He waits, settled in that crack between places where rock turns to cave and night turns to never. He don't chase folk. He don't need to. He asks. That's the part Granny always got quiet about. She said he'd come with a riddle, curled tight around his voice like vines on a fence post. Said he'd speak it low, and the words would feel wrong in your ears, like something whispered from inside your own throat. You only get one chance to answer him. Chapter 2. The Riddle Keeper. Jasper Riggs never had much use for the long way around. He believed a man's worth could be measured in how quick he got from one place to the next and how little he complained about the getting there. He wasn't lazy. He worked hard enough to keep Clementine, his mule, fed and the creditors mostly at bay, but he had the habit of shaving minutes where others took hours. That was how he ended up crossing the ridges near Devil's Backbone on a July evening thick with heat. The limestone there swelled and dipped like the back of some great beast, the trail narrowing until only a fool or a desperate man would press on. Jasper liked to think he was neither, but the truth was he owed a man in Mountain View $2 and a good harness, and his pride couldn't stand the thought of being called slow. The pale sycamore came into view first, its bark peeling in long, curling strips like paper torn from the edge of a Bible. Clementine's ears went forward, then back, then forward again. She slowed, her hooves clinking on the stone like iron tapping bone. Then the air changed. It didn't just still, it died. The cicadas cut off in mid-cry, leaving the world with a hollowness so deep Jasper felt it pressing against his chest. His tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. From the black seam of rock to his right came a sound like water running under stone, only slower, thicker, as if the words were pulling themselves from a place that wasn't meant for light. I carry the rise of mountains and the winding of far rivers. I keep roads no hoof has struck, and towns no bell has woken. My rivers run dry, my fields bear no stock. What be I? The voice was patient, but it carried an edge like frost on iron. Jasper couldn't see the creature, but he saw the outline, spines ridged and sharp, lowering and rising in the dark. His hands shook on the reins. He thought of all the riddles he'd heard in back rooms and over campfires, games meant for drink and laughter. This was nothing like those. This was a question that seemed to reach into his ribs and hold his breath still while it waited for the answer. He swallowed hard. A map, he said, the words thick in his mouth. The spines lowered. The shape shifted backward into the dark, pulling the cold with it. The air filled again, slow as a chest drawing breath after a long time under. Jasper didn't waste another heartbeat. He dug his heels into Clementine's sides, and they clattered down the trail until the sycamore was lost behind the bend. But even as the sweat cooled on his neck, the questions still pressed at the back of his skull, curling around the hum that followed him all the way home. And that night, in the thin hours when the world goes still, Jasper dreamt of a cave with no bottom and a voice that knew his name before he spoke it. Chapter 3: Echoes in the Ground. Silas Riggs had never been a man for chasing shadows, though he'd spent his life under the ones cast by the ridges. His hands were calloused from years of working timber, peeling the bark from black walnut, planing white oak until the grain shone like ripples on a pond. His voice carried the low rumble of a man who spoke rarely, each word dragged up like water from a deep well. He had his grandmother's house now, a squat 2-story frame set against the shoulder of Pine Ridge. Folks passing through never paid much mind to the place. It wasn't grand, just sturdy, with shutters that creaked in the wind and a porch where the boards remembered every footstep. But Silas knew every corner, every creak, every place the light liked to linger in the morning. It was in that attic, one hot August afternoon, that he found the chest. He'd gone up looking for a hammer, though he suspected it had been lost to time and someone else's careless hands decades ago. The attic was thick with dust and heat, the air pressing close like it had nowhere else to go. The chest sat in the far corner, cedar darkened with age, brass hinges green with corrosion. It was the kind of thing made before the world traded patience for speed, dovetailed joints, lid heavy enough to bite your fingers if you let it fall. When he opened it, the smell hit him first, cedar and paper, but also something colder, like the breath of stone in winter. Beneath a folded quilt lay a leather-bound journal. The leather was cracked, edges curling like dried leaves, and the stitching held together by stubbornness alone. Silas sat cross-legged on the attic floor and opened it. The handwriting was a little shaky, but deliberate, each letter pressed deep into the page as if the writer wanted the words to hold fast against time. It was Jasper's hand. The first pages were full of trade notes and mule tallies, the small arithmetic of a man keeping his days accounted for. But deeper in, the words began to change. Sentences stretched, the language turning stranger, more urgent. One page stopped Silas cold. If the Gowrow wakes again, the blood must stand in its place. The hum seemed to rise in the still air of the attic, though he told himself it was the ringing in his own ears. He closed the book, but the words pressed against his skull, heavy as a storm that refused to break. He carried the journal downstairs and set it on the kitchen table, staring at it while the sun slipped toward the horizon. Outside, the cicadas droned, but there was a rhythm under it, a slow thrum that didn't belong. It was a sound he'd heard once before, years ago, deep in the woods near a limestone bluff. He had been young, foolish enough to ignore it, and quick enough to walk away. Now, the sound had found him again, inside his grandmother's attic, curled in the ink of a dead man's hand. Chapter 4. Lost Signal. Caleb and Jonah Lark were the kind of brothers who could talk each other into trouble faster than either could talk the other back out of it. Born just 11 minutes apart, they had the same quick grins, the same pale hair that always looked wind-tangled, and the same restless need to poke at the edges of things folks said to leave alone. They grew up 2 ridges over from Silas, though the Riggs and Larks didn't cross paths much. The Lark boys weren't churchgoers, weren't farmers, weren't hunters. They were the kind who pointed cameras at themselves and grinned wide for strangers they'd never meet. It started small, old camcorders, shaky footage of leaping off haylofts or tossing lit firecrackers into rusted barrels. But in the last 2 years, they'd taken to live streaming their stunts on the internet. Views, Caleb called it, like the word itself was worth more than silver. Views, Jonah echoed, as if repeating it made it truer. The story of the Ma caught their ears in the corner booth of a diner, overheard from an old trucker nursing black coffee. They laughed, nudged each other, and decided they'd found their next video. Just fog and shadows, Caleb said. Fog don't eat people, Jonah grinned. They waited until early evening, when the light was starting to go soft around the edges. The GoPro straps creaked as they tightened them across their chests. Caleb had a flashlight taped to his camera mount. Jonah carried the boom mic like a spear. They headed down toward the cave's black mouth, laughing too loud, trying to keep from hearing how quiet the woods had gotten. The first minutes of the footage were exactly what they expected: babbling creek water, boots scuffing gravel, their own voices echoing off stone. But somewhere past the halfway mark, the sound shifted. The water's chatter cut short. The air thickened like wet cloth pulled across the mouth of the world. Then the growl came, low, steady, rolling into the mic like distant thunder spilling down a valley. "I feed without chewing," the voice said, slow and deliberate, as though it had all the time in the world. "I drink without thirst. I swell without drawing breath. What be I?" The camera shook, but neither brother answered. Jonah's breath quickened, sharp in the mic. Caleb's flashlight flicked toward the dark ahead, catching nothing but the slow shimmer of wet stone. They might have been thinking of a clever answer. They might have been trying to laugh it off. But the Gowrow does not wait forever. The mic caught the scrape of something heavy dragging across rock. Then the hiss of air drawn in quick, cut short like a rope snapping. The rest of the footage was black, 3 minutes of silence, save for a faint hum that grew just enough to feel like it was inside the listener's own chest. When the camera was found months later, the battery was still holding charge, though the screen had cracked clean across the middle. Some swore you could hear breathing in that last stretch of quiet if you played it loud enough. Others said it wasn't breathing at all, but the hills humming over what they'd claimed. Chapter 5. Greasy Hears the Wind. Gracie Moore lived in a weather-beaten house that clung to the bluff like a stubborn root, its porch sagging toward the drop where the land fell away in a long tumble to the valley. She had been born in that house and reckoned she'd die in it, though she never said so out loud. In her 30 years, she had buried both parents, raised her father's hound, and learned to keep her own company without fuss or apology. People in town liked to whisper about her, how she never married, how she never seemed to leave her land unless she had to, how she could stare at a person so long they'd start talking just to fill the air. She ignored them. The hens didn't care if she wore her hair up or down, and the hound, Old Drum, didn't mind if she sat silent for hours, only rising to fetch wood. It was late autumn when she first felt it. The sky had that flat gray look it gets before a cold front pushes in, and the air carried a stillness that set her teeth on edge. Old Drum raised his head from the porch boards, ears twitching, and let out a low growl that made the feathers stand along his neck. Gracie was gathering eggs when the wind died, not the soft slowing of a breeze, but a sudden absence, as if someone had laid a hand across the world's mouth. The trees stood still, every leaf suspended mid-shiver. The fog came next, pouring low between the cedars at the edge of her property. It moved like a living thing, sliding across the ground in slow, deliberate coils. 2 points of light appeared within it, steady, unblinking, set at a height that was all wrong for a man. They glowed with the dull burn of embers buried in ash. The voice came low, almost a hum itself, words dragging like a plow through wet clay. "The more you pull from me," it said, "the greater my shape becomes. What be I?" Gracie's mouth went dry. Her heart thudded in her chest so hard it hurt. The riddle clawed at her mind, dredging up schoolroom memories and half-forgotten puzzle books. She forced her voice steady. "A hole," she said. The eyes narrowed, their glow dimming to the faintest flicker before they vanished into the fog. The air returned in a rush, carrying the scent of damp stone and something faintly metallic. Old Drum whined low in his throat, then barked once toward the cedars, as if trying to prove to himself the danger had passed. Gracie hurried inside, bolting the door, though she knew wood and iron would do little if the thing wanted in. That night she lay in bed listening to the wind move again through the trees, but underneath it, low, steady, patient, she swore she could hear the hum. It had settled into her bones the way cold does in January, and she knew without question that the Gowrow had her measure now. He knew her voice. And one day, he might come back to test it again. Chapter 6. Teeth Beneath Stone. Noah Tran had been in the Ozarks for 2 years, and in all that time, he had never taken the local stories seriously. He taught history at the county schoolhouse, a small, drafty building where the chalk dust clung to the air the way morning fog clings to low pasture. The children whispered their strange tales between lessons, claiming the woods held things with too many teeth or voices that came from inside your own head. Noah humored them with a half-smile, as if he understood something they didn't. He carried himself with the certainty of a man who believed the past could be measured in ink and paper, not in hums under the ridges. It was a Saturday when the cold front came down from the north, dragging with it a sky the color of bruised slate. Noah had set out to the limestone flats to look for arrowheads. He liked to imagine the pieces in his hand, to think of the Caddo and Osage who had shaped them, their skill preserved in stone longer than in any book. The air was still when he reached the bluff's edge. The cicadas had fallen silent. Somewhere far off, a woodpecker's tapping stopped mid-beat, as if the world had been told to hush. Noah crouched to examine a shard of flint, his breath clouding in the sudden chill. Then he saw it. The shape moved where no shadow should have been, emerging from the black seam in the rock face like a piece of the cliff breaking free. The Gauro stepped into view, its body low and ridged, each spine rising from its back like sharpened stakes driven into the earth. Tusks curled forward from its jaw, pale and wet, glinting with the thin light that managed to filter through the clouds. Noah's first thought was how utterly quiet it was. No rustle, no snap of twigs, not even the sound of its breathing. Then the voice came, deep and slow, filling the space around him without moving the air. I race the length of valleys without lifting a foot. What be I? It wasn't a question so much as a command that had taken the shape of words. Noah, thinking it all some strange trick of the wind, let his mouth twist into a smirk. A fool's errand, he said, his voice edged with a kind of half-mocking confidence meant to disguise unease. The Gauro leaned forward until its tusks framed his face, and its breath slid over him, damp and heavy as the inside of a root cellar in August. Wrong. The word rolled out with the weight of stone collapsing in the dark. The ground under Noah's boots seemed to shift, and then the light narrowed, dimming until the bluff, the sky, and the trees beyond it were gone. Some say the Gauro took him whole. Others say it dragged him into the earth itself, sealing the stone behind them so no one could follow. What they agree on is this. The next morning, the limestone was marked with long, parallel grooves, deep enough to cut into the very bone of the ridge. And that night, when the wind moved through the trees again, there was something under it, a low, patient hum, the kind that felt like it was waiting for the next wrong answer. Chapter 7. Silas Returns. Silas had read his great-grandfather's journal a dozen times by the time the first frost laced the sumac leaves. He had memorized every riddle written in that spidery, ink-blotted hand, and though he would never admit it to another living soul, the words had worked themselves into his dreams. In those dreams, the maw was never still. Its black mouth shifted like something alive, widening with each breath he took, the stone around it slick as fresh blood on a butcher's block. Always there were eyes, set low and wide, their glow the faint yellow of an old lantern wick. He told himself that going there was about settling a family debt, about answering a calling etched into his bloodline long before he was born. But truth be told, it was something heavier, a pull that came from deep in the bones, the same way a ridge calls back the sound you shout into it. He left before dawn, taking only his great-grandfather's lantern, a coil of rope, and the journal tucked under his coat. The ridges were quiet that morning, quiet in the way a room gets when someone steps in who shouldn't be there. Even the frost seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what he'd do next. The maw was larger than he'd remembered from boyhood. Its opening yawned wide enough to swallow a wagon whole, the stone around it darkened by centuries of damp. The hum came before he set foot inside, a low vibration that made the iron handle of the lantern tremble against his fingers. As he stepped into the black, the air cooled sharply, carrying the scent of wet limestone and something older, like roots that had never once touched sunlight. His breath plumed before him, curling in the dim glow of the lantern. Then the voice came. I drink without lips. I weep without eyes. I wrap these ridges in my gray coat. What be I? The words hung in the dark, slow and deliberate, as if the creature already knew the answer but was giving him the courtesy of speaking it aloud. Silas didn't hesitate. Fog. The glow of eyes flickered deep in the black. the spines lowered, the hum shifting into something almost like approval. The air loosened its grip on his chest, just enough to let him breathe easier. But as he stood there, his lantern light licking at the edges of the chamber, Silas noticed something he hadn't expected: marks in the rock. Not the deep claw grooves he'd heard described in old stories, but small scratches, almost like tally marks. They trailed along the wall in uneven lines, disappearing into the darkness where his light wouldn't reach. The hum returned, softer this time, yet somehow closer, as though it had moved inside the walls themselves. Silas knew better than to think his answer had earned him safety. It had only earned him the next question. Chapter 8: Offerings to Silence. The deeper Silas walked, the more the cave seemed to press in around him. The air thickened with the weight of places that had never been touched by daylight. His lantern's glow seemed smaller now, as though the dark were drinking it in, sip by slow sip. The ground sloped downward, and the walls closed tight enough that his shoulders brushed the stone. The hum rose and fell, threading through the silence like a slow heartbeat. Behind him, his footsteps echoed soft, then softer still, until they seemed to vanish before finding the end of their own sound. When the passage widened again, it was into a chamber so still it might have been carved from a single breath. The lantern's light caught on shapes scattered across the floor: pale gleams, dark shadows, flashes of brass. Bones lay in small heaps, some gnawed, others worn smooth with age. Skulls stared sightless toward the ceiling, their sockets black as the gaps between stars. But it wasn't just bones. There were watches, their hands stopped mid-tick. Lockets snapped shut, holding secrets no one living could name. Rings, bracelets, coins worn soft from years of handling. Buttons, pins, little folded scraps of paper gone soft and unreadable with damp. It wasn't a hunter's kill pile, it was a collection. Silas stood there, letting the weight of it sink into him. These weren't just trophies, they were the remains of answers given and found wanting. Each piece had belonged to someone who had stood where he stood now, and had not walked back out. A faint sound came from behind him, soft bootsteps, careful but sure. He turned to see Maya Carter step into the chamber's edge of light. She was a slight woman, all sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that didn't miss much. Silas knew her from town, the kind of person who carried herself like she'd already heard every story worth hearing, but came anyway to see if they might still surprise her. "I figured you'd be in here," she said quietly, her voice barely lifting above the hum. "Couldn't let you have all the glory." He gave her a look, but she was already kneeling near a small pile of trinkets, her fingers tracing the edge of a silver locket. She tried the clasp, but it refused to open, the hinge corroded to stubbornness. "He don't just take," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "He keeps." The hum deepened, as if in answer. Somewhere beyond the circle of lantern light, something shifted, stone against stone, or claw against floor. The sound was slow, unhurried, the kind made by something with no need to rush. Silas stepped closer to Maya. "We need to go," he said, low and firm. But she didn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on the locket, her fingers still pressing the stubborn clasp. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked. Silas didn't want to answer, but the truth was there between them. Yes, he felt it. That slow, patient presence in the dark, watching them both the way a man might watch a flame burn down to the last inch of wick. The Go-Ro's silence was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something listening. Chapter 9: A Test of 3. The sound reached them first, not the hum this time, but a deep scrape, like a heavy gate dragged slow across stone. The air grew cooler, not with the clean chill of open winter, but with a dampness that clung to skin and hair. Maya rose to her feet, the locket still in her hand, its weight suddenly heavier than a trinket ought to be. Silas shifted his grip on the lantern, holding it higher, though the light seemed to shrink back from the dark ahead. Then he appeared. The Galro moved into the edge of the glow, his spines catching the lantern light in jagged flashes, each one wet with a sheen that wasn't just water. His body was long, ridged, built low to the ground, the kind of form that could move faster than anything that size had a right to. The tusks curled forward from his jaw like polished bone knives, their tips nicked from use. He stopped before them, eyes fixed, steady as the moon through bare branches. The voice came low, measured, curling through the chamber like smoke. "I am torn from the earth, shut in wood, never freed, yet nearly every hand knows me. What be I?" From behind the two of them came a sound, bare feet on stone. Gracie Moore stepped into the lantern's edge, her face pale but set. Silas didn't know how she'd found them, only that she must have followed some pull of her own. Gracie drew a breath, eyes narrowing. "A coffin," she said. The Galro's spines rose an inch, then lowered halfway, less a nod than a marking of the moment. "Wrong," he said, and the word came like the closing of a tomb lid. Gracie's mouth opened, but the air between them shimmered, and she was gone. No cry, no struggle, only the faintest ripple in the hum, as if her voice had been folded into it. The locket in Maya's hand snapped shut with a sharp, final click. The Galro turned his gaze to Silas. "Feed me, and I live. Drown me, and I die. What be I?" Silas's throat worked once. "Fire," he said, his voice steady but low. The hum shifted, approving, though the eyes did not soften. Then the gaze turned to Maya. "The more you take, the more you leave behind. What be I?" Maya's heart was hammering, but her voice came sure. Footsteps. For a long moment, the Galro did not move. The spines rose, lowered, then settled flat along his back. His eyes shifted from one to the other of them before the words came. "Two leave, one stays." The chamber seemed to breathe then, the darkness pulling back just enough for them to see a narrow split in the stone. Light, thin and cold, filtered through. But the hum followed them, coiling through the passage, as if it were not done with them yet. Chapter 10. The Galro Speaks. The split in the stone did not open to freedom. It bent inward first, curling like the throat of a horn, pulling them deeper before it thought about letting them go. The air there was colder still, heavy with the smell of minerals and something faintly sour, like water left too long in a wooden bucket. Silas kept the lantern raised, the glow shivering across wet rock. Maya followed close behind, the locket still clenched in her fist, though she had stopped looking at it. The hum was louder now, not the same low vibration they had heard before, but something closer to a breathing rhythm, slow and deliberate. The passage emptied into a chamber unlike the others. The ceiling rose high overhead, the walls lined with fungus that glowed faint blue. In the center sat a shallow pool, its surface still as polished glass, reflecting the faint light like the eye of something watching from below. From the far side of that pool, the Galro stepped forward. The blow from the walls slid along his wet hide, lighting each ridge and spine until they stood out like blades laid in rows. He moved with the weight of something that had always belonged to this place, the ground itself seeming to welcome his steps. When he spoke, The sound was not just in their ears, it pressed in against their bones. "I have seen these ridges rise from the deep," he began, voice slow as sediment settling. "I have watched the rivers cut their names into stone, and I have seen those names washed away. I have watched storms chew at the hills, watched them spit the bones of trees into valleys, watched them die and be born again in the same season." He circled the pool as he spoke, the glow of his eyes shifting from Maya to Silas and back again. "Long before your kind came with your axes and your glass eyes, I listened to the steps of others. They came with fire in their hands and questions in their mouths. Some I let pass, others I kept. Those I keep stay here, their voices folded into the hum, their names carried in the breath of the hills." Silas tightened his grip on the lantern. "Why the riddles?" he asked. The Garo paused. A question for a question. Silas felt the weight of those words in the air between them. "The riddles are the measure," the Garo said finally. "Stone measures the years, rivers measure the land, and I measure the worth of those who walk into my dark. A wrong answer is a truth I cannot trust, and I do not release what I cannot trust." The pool rippled then, though no wind touched it. The hum deepened, carrying a tone that made the lantern flame flicker. "You come here with your lights, your wires, your thirst to wake what lies quiet. You think you can bind the old things. You cannot bind what does not sleep." He stepped closer, water dripping from his tusks to the stone. "You have not yet been measured in full." Chapter 11. What Jasper Knew. The glow from the fungus gave the chamber an otherworldly light, painting Silas's skin in pale blues and sickly greens. Maya stood a few steps behind him, her fingers still curled around the stubborn locket, as if holding it kept her tethered to the world above. The Gauro's gaze fixed on Silas. The hum had softened now, lower in pitch but no less heavy. It was the sound of something deciding. "Your blood carries old debt," the Gauro said, voice rolling like deep water under ice. "The man who answered first lives still, in the way stone lives. His voice is here." Silas felt the weight of his great-grandfather's journal pressing in his coat pocket, as though the leather and paper had grown heavier with each step into this place. "Jasper Riggs," he said, quietly, not as a question, but as an admission. The Gauro moved closer, each step stirring the pool at the chamber's heart. The ripples chased one another to the far wall and back again. From the dark beyond the pool, something slid forward. It was small at first, then heavier, a leather-bound book, swollen with damp, the edges curling. Silas recognized it at once. It was the same journal he had carried from his grandmother's attic, only this one was older. The same hand had written it, but the ink was darker, the pages warped from a long soak in stone water. The Gauro's voice deepened. "You hold me close, yet never see me. I pass through all, yet chain none. I speak once, and then I am gone. What be I when all is finished?" The riddle slid into Silas's bones. It was the same one he had read in the attic, only now it felt like more than words. It felt like a key that might turn either way. Maya stepped up beside him. Her eyes moved between him and the Gauro, the set of her jaw telling him she knew the answer, but she didn't speak it. This was his riddle, his blood's weight to carry. He thought of the hills and the hum, of the way names fade on stone after too many seasons of rain. He thought of his own name and how it would sound in the mouth of something that had lived long enough to watch rivers carve valleys. "A name," Silas said, voice low but steady. The Gowro's eyes narrowed, but not in anger. The spines along his back lowered, the light catching them in dull glints. "You measure true," the Gowro said, though there was no warmth in it. The fungus light flickered then, as if a shadow had passed over it. Silas glanced at Maya, but she was staring into the pool, her brow furrowed. He followed her gaze. For a hairbeat, he thought he saw another face there, pale and still, Jasper's face, the eyes empty but knowing. Then it was gone, swallowed by the water's glassy skin. Chapter 12. One leaves. The water in the center of the chamber shivered, as if something deep below had stirred. The ripples spread outward in perfect circles, reaching the stone edge without breaking. Silas tightened his grip on the lantern, its light a small defiance against the press of the dark. The Gowro stood across the pool, his shape looming in the glow of the fungus. His spines caught the light like wet steel, the ridges of his hide glistening where the damp clung. He did not move for several long breaths, and the silence felt like a weight draped over the shoulders of the room. When he spoke, his voice was deeper than before, slower, as though he was speaking a law older than the hills themselves. "Two stand before me," he said, eyes moving between Silas and Maya. "But only one walks back into the wind. One goes. One stays." The hum rose faintly in the walls, vibrating the soles of their boots. Maya's jaw tightened. "We both answered you true," she said, her voice steady but low, as though she knew raising it too high in this place might split the air the wrong way. The Gowro's head tilted slightly. Truth earns breath, not freedom. Breath can be kept here as well as it can be kept under the sky. Silas stepped forward, the lantern light drawing a line between them. "If it's blood you want, take mine," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the finality of a man who had already made peace with the shape of the end. Maya turned to him, eyes sharp. "Don't be stupid." He didn't look at her. His gaze stayed fixed on the creature. "You said my blood carries the debt. That debt's mine to settle." The Gowro's spines shifted, the sound like dry reeds bending in a slow wind. Debt is not always paid by the one who owes it. Sometimes it is taken from what they would keep. The words cut deep, and Silas knew without needing to ask. This was the test behind the riddles, the truth under the questions. The Gowro wasn't just measuring cleverness. He was measuring the shape of what you'd give up. Silas lifted the lantern higher. The flame flickered, then steadied. "You want something to keep? You keep me. Let her walk out." The Gowro's eyes held his for a long stretch of silence, the hum fading until the chamber was nothing but stillness. Finally, the spines lowered. "Go," the creature said, the word aimed at Maya. She shook her head, her lips parting as if to speak, but the ground shifted under their feet. A slab of stone behind her ground open, the sound scraping the air like a dull blade across bone. Beyond it was a narrow path, pale light filtering in from somewhere above. "Silas," she began, but he cut her off. "Go," he said, and this time there was no room for argument. She stepped backward toward the light, her eyes never leaving his until the shadows took him from her sight. Chapter 13. Humming Still. The passage was narrow, the air damp and cool against Maya's face as she climbed. Her hands brushed slick stone, her boots slipping once on a patch of moss, but she didn't stop. Behind her, the faint glow of fungus dimmed until it was nothing, replaced by the thin thread of daylight ahead. When she finally stepped out, The world above felt too open, too bright. The wind came sharp off the ridge, cutting across her cheeks, carrying with it the smell of cedar and cold water. For a moment, she just stood there, blinking in the light, listening to the whippoorwill calling somewhere down the slope. But under it, faint, steady, patient, was the hum. It came from deep beneath her feet, rolling through the stone like a slow pulse. It was not the hum of the wind in the trees or the rush of a far-off creek. It was the same sound she'd heard in the chamber, the same vibration that had carried through every wall, every step. And now she knew it wasn't just the Gowro's voice. It was all the voices he had kept, folded into the earth. She turned to look back at the cave mouth, half hidden by a tumble of rock and bramble. In the daylight, it seemed smaller, almost harmless, but she knew better. The air around it was still, as if even the breeze didn't dare cross its threshold. Maya's hand tightened around the locket. The clasp had opened at some point in the climb, though she didn't remember doing it. Inside was a tiny portrait, faded but clear enough. A man's face, sharp-eyed, with a square jaw and the kind of mustache worn by men who measured their worth in quiet work. She didn't recognize him, but she knew, in the deep way you know certain truths without proof, that he'd been one of the Gowros. She shut the locket and slipped it into her pocket. The hum rose a fraction, like a shiver running through the stone. Maya started down the trail, her steps slow, each one echoing in her mind. She could see the valley spread out below, the patchwork of fields and woods, the ribbon of river cutting through. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain not yet fallen. Halfway down, she stopped and looked back again. The cave was gone from sight behind the trees, but she felt it watching still, the way you feel a storm building long before the first drop falls. She thought of Silas then, not of the moment he told her to go, but of the way he had stood there, lantern lifted, as if he could hold back the dark by sheer stubbornness. The hum swelled, and for a heartbeat she could almost hear his voice in it, low and steady, woven into the rest. The path turned, and the cave was lost to her eyes for good, but the sound followed, soft and sure, threading itself into the rustle of leaves, into the slow beat of her own heart. They say if you stand in the right place on the ridge at dusk, the air will still all at once, and the hills will hum. They say if the Gowro speaks, you answer, because if you don't, the hills will keep you.